Margaret Catherine Sullivan pressed her face against the cold train window and watched the endless prairie roll by. 3 days ago, she had been standing in her tiny Boston apartment, holding a telegram that would change her life forever. Now, as the wheels clacked against the railroad tracks, she was traveling to meet a man she had never seen in a place she had never been. To start a life she could barely imagine, the train car smelled of coal smoke and unwashed bodice. Margaret sat stiffly in her seat, her best blue dress wrinkled from the long journey. She had saved for months to buy this dress, knowing it would be the first thing Thomas Mackenzie would see when she stepped off the train. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the fabric over her knees. What if he took one look at her and decided she wasn't what he expected? What if she had made the biggest mistake of her life? The other passengers had thinned out as the train made its way west. At each stop, people gathered their belongings and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Margaret feeling more alone with each passing mile. She clutched her worn leather satchel closer to her chest. Inside were all her worldly possessions. A few dresses, her mother's silver hairbrush, a small Bible, and the letters that had brought her to this moment, those letters. Margaret pulled them out now, though she had memorized every word. Thomas Mackenzie wrote with a steady hand about his ranch in Wyoming Territory, about the mountains and open sky, about wanting a woman who could share his life and help him build something lasting. His words were kind and respectful, nothing like the rough men she had imagined lived on the frontier. He had promised her a home, security, and a chance at happiness. In return, she had promised to be a good wife, to work hard, and to bring some comfort to his lonely life. The train whistle blew, long and mournful, cutting through Margaret's thoughts. She looked out the window again and saw small lights flickering. In the distance, her heart started beating faster. After 2 weeks of traveling, first by ship from Ireland, where she had been visiting her cousin, then by train across the vast American continent, she was finally almost there. Margaret thought about her life back in Boston. She had worked in a textile factory, sewing for 12 hours a day until her fingers were raw and her back ached. The pay was barely enough to rent a small room in a boarding house and buy simple food. She had no family left in America except for distant relatives who barely acknowledged her existence. When she saw the advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper, something inside her had stirred with hope. Maybe this was her chance to have a real home, to be more than just another factory girl struggling to survive. The conductor walked through the car, calling out station names. Margaret's stomach dropped when she heard him shout, "Sweetwater Station! Next stop, Sweetwater Station!" She quickly folded the letters and put them back in her satchel, then checked her appearance in the small mirror she carried. Her brown hair was coming loose from its pins, and her cheeks were pale from the long journey. She pinched them to bring back some color and tried to tidy her hair as best she could as the train began to slow. Margaret saw a small wooden building with a sign that read Sweetwater Station. Oil lamps flickered on the platform, casting dancing shadows on the few people who waited in the cold October evening. Her breath caught in her throat. One of those people was Thomas Mackenzie, the man she had agreed to marry sight unseen. The train came to a stop with a great hiss of steam and squealing of brakes. Margaret sat frozen in her seat for a moment, watching through the window as passengers from other cars began to get off. She saw families reuniting, businessmen hurrying away with their bags, but she couldn't tell which of the waiting figures might be Tom. A baby cried somewhere in the car behind her. An old man coughed and gathered his belongings. The conductor appeared at her elbow. "Miss, this is Sweetwater Station." "You getting off here?" Margaret nodded and stood on unsteady legs. She had been sitting for so long that her body felt stiff and strange. The conductor helped her down the narrow aisle and onto the platform. The October air was sharp and cold, so different from the stuffy warmth of the train car. She could see her breath in small white puffs. The platform was busier than she had expected. A few ranch hands were loading supplies onto wagons. A woman in a worn coat was greeting what looked like her grown son. But Margaret's eyes searched for the man who had described himself in his letters as tall, with brown hair and kind eyes. Most of the passengers had already scattered into the night when a figure approached her. He was indeed tall, and even in the dim lamplight, she could see he had removed his hat respectfully. His hair was brown but streaked with gray, and his face was weathered in a way that spoke of years spent working outdoors under the sun and wind. "Miss Sullivan?" His voice was gentle, not harsh like she had feared. "I'm Thomas Mackenzie. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. His letters had been kind, but she had still worried about what kind of man would need to advertise for a wife. Looking at him now, she saw no meanness in his face, no roughness in his manner. He seemed genuinely pleased to see her, not disappointed, as she had feared he might be. "The journey was long, but I'm grateful to be here," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom smiled, and Margaret noticed that his eyes crinkled at the corners when he did. "I'm sure you must be tired. Let me help you with your trunk." He gestured to where her belongings had been unloaded from the train. Margaret had packed everything she owned into one small trunk, and seeing it sitting there on the platform made her realize how little she was bringing to this new life. Tom lifted it easily, as if it weighed nothing at all. "I brought the wagon," he said, leading her toward a sturdy wooden wagon hitched to 2 horses. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from here. I know it's late, but I thought you might want to see your new home tonight rather than stay in town." Margaret nodded, though the word home made her stomach flutter with nervousness. She had never owned a home before, had never even lived anywhere that truly felt like home. The idea that she might soon have a place where she belonged seemed almost too wonderful to believe. Tom helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand steady and respectful. He tucked a wool blanket around her legs to keep her warm, then climbed up beside her. As they drove away from the station, Margaret looked back once at the train that had brought her here. Steam still rose from its engine, and she could hear the distant sound of the whistle as it prepared to continue its journey west. But her journey was just beginning. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as they rolled away from Sweetwater Station. Margaret pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and stole glances at the man sitting beside her. Thomas Mackenzie held the reins with easy confidence, his weathered hands steady as he guided the horses through the darkness. He was older than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun and wind. "I hope the cold isn't too much for you," Tom said, his voice gentle in the quiet night. "Wyoming can be harsh, especially for someone coming from back east." Margaret shook her head quickly. "Oh no, it's fine. I'm used to cold weather, but Boston winters can be quite bitter." "That's good to hear," Tom replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Though I have to warn you, prairie winter is different from city winter. Out here, when the wind blows, there's nothing to stop it for 100 miles. As they rode, Tom pointed out landmarks in the moonlight. A stand of cottonwood trees marked a creek that ran through his property. A distant cluster of lights belonged to his nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, who lived about 3 miles away. Margaret listened carefully, trying to memorize everything he told her. This was her world now, and she wanted to learn it quickly. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, genuinely curious. His letters had mentioned cattle and horses, but she had never seen a real ranch before. Tom's face lit up with enthusiasm. "It's not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's mine. I have about 200 head of cattle right now, hoping to build the herd up over the next few years. There's good grazing land along the creek, and the house sits up on a little rise where you can see for miles in every direction." Margaret tried to picture it, but her imagination could only conjure images from the dime novels she had read. "Have you lived there long?" "Built the house myself about 5 years ago," Tom said with obvious pride. "Started with just a cabin, but I've been adding to it bit by bit. It's got a proper kitchen now, and a sitting room with a stone fireplace. I even put in wooden floors throughout, not just dirt like some folks make do with." The warmth in his voice when he talked about his home made Margaret feel a little more at ease. She had worried about what kind of rough dwelling she might be expected to live in, but Tom sounded like a man who took care of his property. "What made you decide to ... Margaret hesitated, not sure how to phrase the question that had been on her mind since she first read his advertisement. What made you decide to look for a wife through the newspaper? Tom was quiet for a moment, and Margaret worried she had asked something too personal. But when he spoke, his voice was honest and open. Loneliness, mostly. I've been out here by myself for 5 years, and while I love the land and the work, a man needs more than cattle for company. I tried courting girls in town, but most of them want to stay close to civilization. They take one look at a rancher and see only hard work and isolation. Margaret understood that feeling. She had spent enough time feeling invisible in Boston to know what it was like to be overlooked. Besides, Tom continued, I figured a woman who was brave enough to travel all this way to marry a stranger might be the kind of woman who could handle frontier life. Takes courage to leave everything behind and start over. Margaret felt a flush of pride at his words. She had been so focused on her own fears that she hadn't thought about her decision as brave, but maybe it was. Maybe she was stronger than she had given herself credit for. The conversation flowed easily as they rode. Tom asked about her life in Boston, and Margaret found herself talking more freely than she had expected. She told him about working in the textile factory, about the long hours and poor pay, about the cramped boarding house where she had lived with a dozen other working girls. She didn't mention how lonely she had been, how she had sometimes gone days without speaking to anyone except to say yes, sir, and no, sir, to her supervisor. That sounds like a hard life, Tom said quietly when she finished. It was, Margaret admitted, but it taught me to work hard and take care of myself. I'm not afraid of long hours or difficult tasks. That's good, Tom said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. Ranch life isn't easy, especially for a woman, but I think you might be surprised how much you like it. There's something about this land that gets into your blood. They crested a small hill, and Tom pointed ahead into the darkness. There it is. Home, Margaret strained to see what he was pointing at. Gradually, she made out the dark outline of a house against the starlit sky. It was larger than she had expected, with a chimney that rose straight and tall from the roof. Warm light glowed from several windows, and she could see the outline of a barn and other outbuildings nearby. It's beautiful, she said, and meant it. After years of living in cramped city quarters, the idea of all this space seemed like a dream. Tom beamed with pride. I lit the lamps before I left for the station. Thought it would be nice for you to see it welcoming when you arrived. The thoughtfulness of that gesture touched Margaret deeply. She had expected to be treated fairly, but she hadn't expected such kindness. As they approached the house, Tom helped her down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly. Tom steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow, then quickly stepped back to give her space. Let me show you inside, he said, lifting her trunk from the wagon. I know you must be exhausted. The front door opened into a sitting room that was bigger than Margaret's entire boarding house room had been. A fire crackled cheerfully in the stone fireplace, and oil lamps cast warm light over comfortable furniture. The wooden floors were polished and clean, and colorful rugs were scattered about. This is lovely, Margaret said, looking around in wonder. She had never been in a house that felt so welcoming. Kitchen's through there, Tom said, pointing to a doorway. And there are 2 bedrooms upstairs. He cleared his throat suddenly, looking uncomfortable. I've prepared the back bedroom for you. Figured you might want some privacy while you're getting settled. Margaret felt a wave of relief. She had been dreading this moment, wondering what Tom would expect of her on her first night. His consideration and respect meant more to her than he could know. Thank you, she said quietly. That's very thoughtful. Tom carried her trunk upstairs and showed her to a small but comfortable room with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the moonlit prairie. He had even put fresh wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. I'll let you get some rest, he said, setting down her trunk. There's water in the pitcher, and I left some soap and clean towels for you. If you need anything at all, just call out. I'll be right across the hall. After he left, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new room. For the first time in years, she had a space that was truly hers. The bed was soft, the room was clean, and outside her window stretched more land than she had. ever seen. Maybe, just maybe, this crazy decision to become a mail-order bride was going to work out after all. Margaret woke to the sound of roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. She was in Wyoming territory, in a house that belonged to Thomas Mackenzie. The man she had agreed to marry. She dressed quickly in her oldest work dress and made her way downstairs. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the kitchen, and she found Tom standing at the stove, his sleeves rolled up in an apron tied around his waist. He looked up when she entered, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well. I thought you might be hungry after your long journey." Margaret felt a flutter of embarrassment. "I should be cooking for you." "I'm sorry, I overslept." Tom waved away her apology. "Nonsense. You've been traveling for days? Besides, I've been cooking for myself for 5 years. I won't starve if I make breakfast one more time." He set a plate before her filled with eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits. The food was simple but well prepared, and Margaret realized how hungry she actually was. She had been too nervous to eat much on the train. "This is delicious," she said, taking a bite of the fluffy biscuit. "You're a better cook than I expected," Tom chuckled. "Don't get too impressed. I can make about 5 different meals, and you'll probably get tired of them quickly. I'm hoping you might know some recipes I don't." "I can cook," Margaret said, feeling more confident. "I had to learn when I was living on my own. Nothing fancy, but I can make a meal stretch and keep it filling." Over the next few days, they settled into a routine. Tom would wake early to tend to his cattle and horses, while Margaret explored the house and began to understand how everything worked. The kitchen had a large wood-burning stove that took some getting used to, but it heated the whole downstairs area efficiently. There was a pantry stocked with basics like flour, beans, and preserved vegetables, and a root cellar where Tom kept potatoes, onions, and other supplies. Margaret had never lived in a house with so much space. In Boston, she had shared a single room with 2 other girls, and privacy had been impossible. Here, she could walk from room to room without bumping into anyone, and the silence was both wonderful and slightly unsettling. She was used to the constant noise of the city, horses and carriages, shouting vendors, factory whistles. The quiet of the prairie took some adjustment. On her 3rd morning, Tom found her standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the vast landscape that stretched to the horizon. "It's so big," she said softly. "I never imagined anywhere could be so big." "Takes some getting used to," Tom agreed, joining her at the window. "Some folks find it lonely, but I've always found it peaceful. Makes you feel like you can breathe." Margaret understood what he meant. Despite the vastness, she was beginning to feel less trapped than she had in the crowded city. Here, she could see the sky from edge to edge, and the air was clean and fresh. "Wood. You like to learn how to milk the cow?" Tom asked. "It's something you'll need to know, and Bessie is gentle." "She won't give you any trouble," Margaret nodded eagerly. She wanted to be useful, to prove that she could handle ranch life. Tom led her to the barn, where a brown and white cow stood patiently waiting. He showed her how to position the bucket, how to grip the udder, and how to pull in a steady rhythm. "Don't be afraid to squeeze," he said, demonstrating. "Bessie's used to it. She actually likes being milked. It relieves the pressure." Margaret's first attempts were clumsy, and she only managed to get a few drops of milk in the bucket. But Tom was patient, adjusting her hands and encouraging her to try again. After 20 minutes, she had managed to fill the bucket halfway. That's excellent for your first time," Tom said genuinely. "Most people don't get the hang of it that quickly." The praise made Margaret glow with pride. She had always been good with her hands from her work in the textile factory, but this was different. This was a skill that would help her take care of her new home. As the days passed, Tom taught her other essential tasks. He showed her how to feed the chickens and collect eggs, how to tend the vegetable garden that was starting to die back for winter, and how to split kindling for the stove. Margaret proved to be a quick learner, and she threw herself into each task with determination. In return, she began to transform the house. Tom had kept it clean and functional, but it lacked the touches that made a house feel like a home. Margaret washed all the curtains and mended the tears she found. She rearranged the furniture to make the rooms feel more welcoming. She even picked the last of the prairie flowers and put them in jars around the house. "It looks different," Tom said one evening, glancing around the sitting room. "Warmer, somehow." "I hope you don't mind," Margaret said quickly. "I just thought it might be nice to ... "I love it," Tom interrupted. "I never realized how bare everything looked before. You have a good eye for making things beautiful." Their conversations during meals became longer and more personal. Tom told her about his childhood in Missouri, how his parents had died in a fever epidemic when he was 25, leaving him alone in the world. He had sold their farm and used the money to buy land in Wyoming Territory, drawn by the promise of wide open spaces and the chance to build something entirely his own. "I've never regretted coming here," he said, "but I did miss having family, having someone to share things with." Margaret shared her own story more gradually. She told him about growing up in Ireland, how her family had saved for years to send her to America when she was 18. She spoke about the heartbreak of leaving her parents and younger siblings, and how she had struggled to find her place in Boston. "I always felt like I was just surviving," she admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. "Working just to pay rent, eating just to keep going. I never felt like I was building anything or moving toward something better." "And now?" Tom asked gently. Margaret looked around the cozy room, at the fire crackling in the hearth and the warm lamplight on the wooden walls. "Now I feel like I'm part of something, like I'm helping to build something that matters." Tom's face softened. "That's exactly what I was hoping for. I wanted a partner, not just a housekeeper. Someone who would see this place as home, not just a job." As autumn progressed, Margaret found herself looking forward to Tom's return each evening. She would watch from the kitchen window as he rode in from checking on the cattle, and she would have coffee ready when he came through the door. He would tell her about his day, and she would share what she had accomplished around the house. One evening, as Margaret was mending one of Tom's shirts, she realized that she was humming. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt content enough to hum while working. The recognition surprised her. She was actually happy. "You have a lovely voice," Tom said from across the room where he was reading a week-old newspaper. "I haven't heard singing in this house for years." Margaret blushed. "I didn't realize I was making noise." "It's not noise," Tom said firmly. "It's one of the things that makes this feel like home." They looked at each other across the room, and Margaret felt something shift between them. What had started as a practical arrangement was becoming something deeper. She was beginning to care about this quiet, gentle man who had welcomed her with such kindness. And from the way he looked at her, she thought he might be feeling the same way. Margaret woke to an eerie silence. The usual sounds of morning were missing, no birds chirping, no wind rustling through the grass, no distant lowing of cattle. She sat up in bed and looked toward the window, gasping at what she saw. Snow was falling so thickly that she could barely see the barn. Just 50 yards away, she dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Tom already in the kitchen, his face tight with worry as he peered out the window. "How bad is it?" she asked, joining him at the window. "Bad," Tom said grimly. "This is what we call a blue norther. The temperature has dropped 30 degrees since yesterday, and this snow isn't stopping anytime soon. I've seen storms like this kill cattle by the hundreds." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She had learned enough about ranch life to know that the cattle were their future. Without them, Tom would have no income, no way to pay for supplies or expand the ranch. "What can we do?" she asked. Tom was already pulling on his heaviest coat. "I need to get out there and drive the herd to the sheltered valley by the creek. The trees will give them some protection from the wind, and there's better grass there. But I have to do it fast before the snow gets too deep." "I'm coming with you," Margaret said without hesitation. Tom shook his head. "No, it's too dangerous. The wind is strong enough to knock a person down, and visibility is almost zero. I can't risk you getting lost or hurt." "Tom," Margaret said firmly. "You can't handle 200 head of cattle by yourself in this weather. You need help, and I'm the only help you have." Tom looked at her for a long moment, seeing the determination in her eyes. He knew she was right. His nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and by the time he could get there and back, it might be too late. "All right," he said finally. "But you stay close to me at all times. We're going to tie a rope between us so we don't get separated." Margaret nodded and began pulling on every warm piece of clothing she owned. Tom found an extra pair of his gloves for her hands and wrapped a thick scarf around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. Outside, the wind hit them like a physical force. Margaret had never experienced anything like it. The snow stung her face and the cold burned her lungs with each breath. She could understand why people died in storms like this. It was like being in a white, howling world where nothing existed. Except the next step forward. Tom had tied a rope around his waist and the other end around Margaret's. She followed him toward the sound of the cattle, who were huddled together in a miserable group near the barn. The animals were already covered with snow, their heads down against the wind. "We need to get them moving toward the creek," Tom shouted. "Over the wind. Walk behind them and wave your arms. Make noise. Don't let them turn back." For the next 3 hours, Margaret and Tom worked in the blinding snow to move the cattle. It was the hardest physical work Margaret had ever done. Her legs ached from walking through snow that was already knee-deep in places. Her hands were numb despite the gloves, and her face felt frozen. But she kept going, driven by the knowledge that their future depended on saving these animals. The cattle didn't want to move. They were frightened and cold, and their instinct was to huddle together rather than venture into the storm. Margaret found herself shouting at them, waving her arms, and even pushing against their massive sides when they tried to turn back toward the barn. "Keep going," Tom called to her when she stumbled in a snowdrift. "We're almost there." When they finally reached the sheltered valley, Margaret was exhausted. But as she watched the cattle settle into the protection of the trees, she felt a surge of pride. They had done it. Together, they had saved the herd. Tom pulled her close, and for a moment they stood together in the snow, breathing hard from their effort. "I couldn't have done that without you," he said, his voice warm despite the cold. "You saved them as much as I did." Margaret looked up at him, snow clinging to his eyebrows and beard. In that moment, she realized something had changed between them. They were no longer just two people sharing a house and learning to get along. They were partners. They were a team. The storm lasted for 3 days. Margaret and Tom took turns checking on the cattle, making sure they stayed in the protected valley. They worked together to keep the house warm, taking shifts to feed the fire through the night. They shared meals and stories, and Margaret found herself watching Tom with new eyes. She saw how he put the welfare of his animals before his own comfort, trudging through the snow to check on them even when he was exhausted. She saw how he trusted her judgment and treated her as an equal partner rather than just a helper. She saw the quiet strength that had allowed him to build a life in this harsh but beautiful land. On the third evening, as the storm finally began to clear, Tom sat down beside Margaret on the sofa. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about us, about what we're doing here." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean?" "When I wrote that advertisement, I was looking for a practical arrangement. A woman who could help me run the ranch, someone I could respect, and who could respect me. But these past few weeks, especially these last few days," he paused, searching for the right words, "I think we could have something more than just a business arrangement." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted. "I came here expecting to fulfill a contract, but I've found something I never expected to find." "What's that?" Tom asked gently. "A home. A real home with someone who sees me as more than just a pair of hands to work. Someone who values what I bring to this partnership." Tom reached for her hand. "Would you consider making this official? Not just for practical reasons, but because we choose each other?" Margaret looked at their joined hands, calloused from hard work but warm and gentle. "Are you asking me to marry you, Tom Mackenzie?" "I am," he said simply. "Will you marry me, Margaret Sullivan?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." The circuit preacher was due to visit the area for Thanksgiving, and Tom arranged for their wedding to take place then. Word spread quickly among the scattered ranch families, and despite the recent storm, a dozen neighbors gathered at the Mackenzie Ranch on Thanksgiving Day. Margaret wore her best dress, the blue one she had worn when she first arrived. Tom had somehow managed to find a small bouquet of dried flowers. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, held in the sitting room with the stone fireplace crackling behind them. "Do you, Thomas Mackenzie, take this woman to be your wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Tom said, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Do you, Margaret Sullivan, take this man to be your wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Margaret said, meaning every word. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Tom kissed her gently, and Margaret felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The neighbors cheered and shared a simple meal, celebrating not just the marriage, but the beginning of what they all hoped would be a successful partnership. As winter settled in for real, Margaret and Tom faced new challenges together. The house was comfortable, but keeping it warm required constant attention to the fire. Food had to be carefully rationed to last until spring. The cattle needed regular checking to make sure they were surviving the harsh weather, but they faced these challenges as a team. When the pump froze, they worked together to thaw it. When supplies ran low, they made do with what they had. When loneliness threatened during the long, dark evenings, they had each other for companionship. Margaret discovered that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. Tom discovered that having a true partner made even the hardest work bearable. Together they were building something that would last. Winter settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, and Margaret learned what Tom had meant when he said prairie winter was different from city winter. The wind never seemed to stop, and on the worst days it howled around the house like a living thing trying to get inside. Snow piled up against the windows, and some mornings Tom had to dig a path just to reach the barn. But inside their home, warmth and contentment grew day by day. Margaret had never experienced the quiet joy of waking up next to someone who truly cared about her. Tom was gentle and patient, never demanding more than she was ready to give. Their physical relationship developed slowly, built on the foundation of trust and respect they had established during those first weeks together. "I never thought I could be this happy," Margaret confessed one evening as they sat by the fire. She was knitting socks for Tom, her fingers moving steadily while they talked. "Neither did I," Tom replied, looking up from the ranch accounts he was working on. "I always thought marriage would be nice, but I never imagined having a real partner. Someone who understood what I was trying to build here." Margaret had surprised them both by taking an interest in the financial side of the ranch. She had always been good with numbers from her factory work, where she had to calculate piece rates and manage her small wages. Now she helped Tom plan purchases, figure out how many cattle they could afford to buy in spring, and keep track of expenses. "We should think about getting a milk cow," she said, looking up from her knitting. "Bessie is getting older, and if we had 2 cows, we could make butter and cheese to sell in town. That would bring in some extra money." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good idea. And maybe we could expand the chicken coop. You've done so well with the hens we have, and eggs always sell well." These conversations filled Margaret with pride. Tom didn't just listen to her ideas, he valued them. He treated her as an equal partner in their plans for the future. It was so different from the life she had known in Boston, where women were expected to work but never to think beyond their immediate tasks. As the winter deepened, their evening routines became precious to both of them. After supper, Tom would work on ranch business while Margaret sewed or knitted. They would talk about their day, their plans, their dreams. Sometimes Margaret would read aloud from the few books they owned, her voice filling the quiet house with stories of adventure and romance. You have a gift for that, Tom said one evening after she had finished reading a chapter from a novel about the California gold rush. You make the characters come alive. Margaret blushed with pleasure. I always loved reading, but I never had much time for it when I was working at the factory. This is like having a luxury I never expected. You deserve every good thing, Tom sighed quietly. You work harder than anyone I know, and you never complain about the difficulties. The difficulties were real. Some days the wind was so strong that going outside was dangerous. The water pump froze regularly, and they had to melt snow for washing and drinking. Food supplies had to be carefully managed, and by February they were eating a lot of beans and preserved vegetables. But Margaret had learned to find joy in small things. She loved the way frost made patterns on the windows. She enjoyed the challenge of creating tasty meals from simple ingredients. She found satisfaction in keeping their home warm and comfortable even when the world outside was harsh and cold. I think you're a natural pioneer, Tom told her one day when she had successfully repaired a broken chair using only string and determination. You see problems as challenges to solve, not obstacles to complain about. I learned that from you, Margaret replied. You never waste time wishing things were different. You just figure out how to make the best of what you have. When spring finally came, it felt like a miracle. The snow melted rapidly, creating rushing streams and turning the prairie into a carpet of green grass and wildflowers. The cattle, thin from the hard winter, began to put on weight as they grazed on the fresh grass. Margaret planted a larger garden than Tom had ever attempted, with rows of vegetables and herbs that would help feed them through the next winter. You've transformed this place, Tom said, watching her work in the garden. It's not just a ranch anymore. It's a real homestead. Margaret looked up from the tomato plants she was setting out. We've transformed it together. I couldn't have done any of this without your teaching and support. Tom walked over and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her waist. I love you, Margaret Mackenzie, he said, using her married name with obvious pleasure. I love you too, Thomas. Mackenzie, she replied, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him. More than I ever thought possible. Their love had grown quietly, like plants taking root in good soil. There had been no dramatic declarations or sudden realizations. Instead, it had developed through shared work, quiet conversations, and the gradual understanding that they were perfectly suited to each other. In May, Tom bought 20 more head of cattle with money they had saved through Margaret's careful management of their expenses. He also purchased the second milk cow Margaret had wanted, and they began making butter and cheese to sell in town. Margaret's eggs were already popular with the townspeople, and she was building a reputation for quality products. We're doing well, Tom said one evening as they went over their accounts. Better than I ever expected. We might even be able to add another room to the house before next winter. Margaret smiled but didn't answer immediately. She had been feeling strange lately, tired in the mornings and queasy around certain foods. She had a suspicion about what might be causing these symptoms, but she wanted to be sure before she said anything. A week later, her suspicions were confirmed. She was expecting their first child. Margaret sat in the kitchen, holding the knowledge like a precious secret, trying to decide how to tell Tom. She wanted the moment to be special, something they would both remember that evening as Tom sat in his usual chair by the fire. Margaret approached him with a small bundle in her hands. I have something for you, she said, her voice shaking slightly with excitement. Tom looked puzzled as she handed him the bundle. Inside was a tiny knitted cap, barely big enough to fit in his palm. Margaret? He said, his voice filled with wonder. Does this mean— Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. We're going to have a baby. Tom stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. He swept Margaret into his arms, spinning her around the room while she laughed with joy. When? He asked, setting her down gently. Early winter, I think. January or February? Tom's face glowed with happiness. Our child will be born right here, in this house we've built together. They'll grow up knowing this land, understanding what it means to work for something and build something lasting. Margaret nodded, imagining their child running through the House, playing in the garden, learning the same skills Tom had taught her. They'll have everything we never had, she said. A real home, parents who love each other, and land of their own. As summer progressed, Margaret's pregnancy progressed smoothly. She continued to work in the garden and help with the ranch, though. Tom became increasingly protective and insisted on doing the heavier tasks. Their neighbors, the Hendersons, visited more often, and Mrs. Henderson shared advice about pregnancy and childbirth. "You're glowing," Mrs. Henderson said one afternoon as she helped Margaret preserve vegetables for winter. "I've never seen a woman so happy about having a baby." "I never thought I would have a family," Margaret admitted. "When I was working in Boston, I couldn't imagine how I would ever be able to support children. Now I can't imagine anything better than raising our children here with Tom." By autumn, their ranch was thriving. The cattle were fat and healthy, the garden had produced an abundant harvest, and they had enough money saved to buy more land if the opportunity arose. Tom had built a cradle for the baby, working on it in the evenings while Margaret knitted tiny clothes. "I keep thinking about that night you arrived," Tom said one evening as they sat together, Margaret's hand resting on her rounded belly. "I was so nervous about meeting you. I had no idea whether we would even be able to stand each other," Margaret laughed. "I was terrified. I thought you might take one look at me and put me back on the train. Instead, I found the perfect partner," Tom said, leaning over to kiss her. "Someone who could make this house a home, who could help me build something bigger than I ever imagined. We found each other," Margaret corrected gently, "and we built something beautiful together." As winter approached again, Margaret felt none of the anxiety she had experienced the year before. This time she knew what to expect. She had confidence in her ability to manage their home and help Tom with the ranch. Most importantly, she had the security of knowing that she was loved and valued. Their marriage had become exactly what both of them had hoped for but never dared to expect. It was a partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine affection. They had proven that love could grow from the simplest beginnings, nurtured by kindness, hard work, and the courage to build a life together in an untamed land. The mail-order bride who had arrived on the last train had found not just a husband, but a true partner, a real home, and a love that would last a lifetime.